The Murky Water River has been the lifeblood of my family for 3 generations. My grandfather, Elias, first cast his nets here when the town of Havenwood was little more than a logging camp. My father, Samuel, knew every bend and eddy, like the lines on his own hand. And now, me, Jacob. I pilot the same clunky, rust-streaked fishing boat, the River Maiden that my father left me. The routine is etched into my soul. Wake before the sun paints the sky, chug down a thermos of bitter coffee, and let the familiar rumble of the diesel engine be my only company as I head to the deep channel where the catfish like to hide. The river is a creature of habit, much like me. It gives and it takes. Most days it gives generously, enough fish to sell at the market, enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Sometimes it takes. A net gets snagged on a submerged log. A prop gets fouled by discarded junk. I've pulled up everything you can imagine from its depths. Tires, a rusted-out safe someone had clearly tried to crack open, even a perfectly preserved porcelain doll from the last century that now sits on my mantelpiece, its glassy eyes staring into nothing. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. Dead wrong. That morning started like any other. A thick, pearly fog clung to the water's surface, muffling the world in a blanket of quiet dampness. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I'd set my largest dragnet the evening before, anchoring it in the old deeps, a spot my dad swore was so deep it had no bottom. It was always a gamble. The currents there were tricky, but the payoff could be huge. A haul from the old deeps could set me up for a month. I reached the marker buoy just as the first sliver of sun breached the horizon, turning the fog from gray to a soft glowing gold. I switched on the winch, the gears grinding with a familiar gritty protest. The cable grew taut, and I watched the surface of the water, waiting for the telltale churn of a net full of struggling fish. But something was different. The strain on the winch was immense, far more than any catch I'd ever hauled. The motor whined, its pitch rising to a desperate scream. The entire boat listed to starboard, the gunwale dipping dangerously close to the dark water. My first thought was a snag, a big one, maybe a waterlogged tree trunk or a piece of old farm equipment washed down from the spring floods. I cursed under my breath, ready to cut the line. Losing $1,000 net would hurt, but not as much as capsizing the River Maiden in the middle of the river. I put my hand on the emergency release lever, but something stopped me. It wasn't the sharp, unyielding tension of a deadweight snag. There was a subtle give to it, a kind of heavy, sluggish resistance that felt almost deliberate. Driven by a curiosity that overrode my common sense, I decided to give it a little more gas. I throttled the winch motor, feeding it power in short, controlled bursts. The steel cable, thick as my thumb, vibrated like a guitar string, humming with a low, resonant frequency that I could feel in the fillings of my teeth. Slowly, painfully, something began to rise from the depths. The water broke, not with the thrashing of fish, but with a slow, ominous swell. The net breached the surface, and my breath caught in my chest. It wasn't a log. It wasn't a school of massive catfish. It was a single, solid object, impossibly large, wrapped in the tight embrace of the nylon mesh. It was a cube, a perfect, geometrically precise cube, maybe 4 feet on each side. The surface wasn't rusted metal or mossy stone. It was a deep, matte black, a black so absolute it seemed to drink the morning light. It reflected nothing. Not the sky, not the water, not my own stunned face. It was like a hole cut into the fabric of reality. Adrenaline surged through me, a cocktail of fear and utter fascination. I had to get it on board. The winch strained, the boat groaned, but finally, with a deafening thud that shook the entire vessel, the cube settled onto the deck. Water streamed off it, but the surface itself seemed instantly dry, leaving no moisture behind. I cut the engine, and in the sudden silence, the world felt like it was holding its breath. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the river against the hull and the frantic hammering of my own heart. I circled it cautiously, like it was a sleeping predator. The edges were razor-sharp, the corners perfect 90-degree angles. There were no seams, No rivets, no bolts. It looked as if it had been carved from a single piece of unknown material. I reached out a hesitant hand, my fingers trembling, and touched its surface. It was cool, unnaturally so, with the smoothness of polished obsidian. But there was a strange quality to it, a subtle vibration that hummed up my arm, a barely perceptible energy that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. What in God's name was this thing? Where had it come from? The old deeps were miles from any industrial site. No one could have dropped this here. I ran my hands over every inch of its surface, searching for a latch, a button, a keyhole, any sign of how to open it, or what it was. Nothing. It was a perfect, inscrutable enigma. Frustrated, I balled my fist and knocked on it. The sound was bizarre. It wasn't the clang of hollow metal or the dull thud of a solid block. It was a low, resonant chime, like a deep bell struck miles away, a sound that seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long time. As the last echo of the chime faded, a faint light appeared on the surface beneath my hand. It wasn't a light bulb turning on. It was more like the material itself had begun to glow from within. A hairline crack of pure blue-white light split the black surface, silent and precise. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. The line of light spread, branching out, forming intricate geometric patterns that spiderwebbed across the face of the cube. It wasn't random. It was a design, a language, a map. The low hum I'd felt earlier was now audible, a soft, steady thrum that vibrated through the wooden deck and up into the soles of my boots. The air around the cube grew cold, and the fog on the river began to swirl around it, drawn in as if by a vortex. The light grew brighter, the hum grew louder, and I stood frozen, a simple fisherman on a small boat, watching as something that had no right to exist slowly, terrifyingly, began to wake up. The light wasn't just on the surface, it was the surface. The intricate patterns bloomed like frost on a window pane, flowing with a liquid grace that defied the cube's solid nature. The hum intensified, sinking into my bones, a deep thrumming that felt ancient and powerful. I was paralyzed, a spectator to a private miracle or an impending disaster. The swirling fog around the boat seemed to thicken, forming a curtain that cut me and this impossible object off from the rest of the world. Then the patterns converged at the very center of the top face, coalescing into a single point of light, so bright I had to shield my eyes. A beam of that same blue-white light, no thicker than a pencil, shot straight up from the cube. It stopped about 6 feet above the surface, and then it began to expand, to unfold. The light wasn't just light anymore, it was information, it was imagery. A 3-dimensional picture hung in the air above the cube, shimmering like a heat haze. My jaw went slack. It was a perfect miniature replica of my boat, the River Maiden. I could see every patch of rust, the fraying ropes, the thermos of coffee I'd left by the wheel. And there, standing on the deck, was a tiny, glowing figure of me, mouth agape, staring up at the projection of myself. My blood ran cold. It was seeing me. It knew I was here. Before I could process the terrifying intimacy of that revelation, the image began to move. It pulled back, shrinking the boat to a speck on the surface of the murky water river. I saw the familiar curves of the riverbanks, the cluster of buildings that was Havenwood, the dark green expanse of the national forest that surrounded us. The image kept pulling back, the perspective soaring higher and higher. I saw our county, then the state, a patchwork of farms and highways. It didn't stop. The curve of the earth became visible, a breathtaking arc of blue and white against an infinite black. I saw the moon, a pockmarked pearl, drift past. The sun became a star among other stars. The galaxy bloomed in the air above my deck, a swirling, majestic spiral of light. I, Jacob, a man who'd never been further than the state capital, was staring at a perfect real-time map of the Milky Way. The sheer scale of it was crushing, a physical weight on my soul. I was nothing. A fleck of dust on a fleck of dust. The hum of the cube was the only thing grounding me, the engine of this cosmic journey. Just as my mind began to fray at the edges, the journey reversed. The image plunged back through the star fields, not towards my familiar blue planet, but towards a different arm of the galaxy, a different star system. It zeroed in on a planet, and the air in my lungs turned to ice. It was a world of twin suns, one a fiery orange, the other a brilliant violet, casting long, eerie shadows across a landscape of crystalline forests and metallic silver rivers. Towering structures that defied gravity pierced a sky the color of amethyst. It was alien, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. The projection held on this impossible vista for a long moment. Then, as silently as it began, it collapsed back into the cube. The light receded, the patterns faded, and the deep hum died away. Once again, it was just a perfect black cube sitting on my deck, reflecting nothing. The morning sun was higher now, burning away the last of the fog. The world felt normal again, except for the 4-foot square piece of impossibility that was making my boat list to one side. I was shaking, my knees weak. My mind reeled, trying to stitch together what I had just seen. A map. A journey. It showed me where I was, and then it showed me where it was from. As I stared, a subtle click echoed from the cube. On the top face, a section no bigger than my hand seamlessly retracted, sinking into the body of the object to reveal a small, recessed compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of material that looked like spun moonlight, was a single object. It was a handheld device about the size of a small river stone, made of the same cool black material as the cube. Its surface was adorned with the same kind of intricate glowing lines I had just seen, only these were dormant, faint gray traceries etched into the black. My fisherman's pragmatism, buried under an avalanche of awe and fear, finally clawed its way back to the surface. What do I do? Throw it back? My whole body screamed no. This was everything. A discovery that would change the world. But who could I tell? Sheriff Brody? He was a good man, but he'd call the feds so fast my head would spin. This thing would be swallowed by some Black Ops government agency, and I'd be lucky if I didn't disappear with it. No, this was my catch. My secret. My decision was made. I had to get it home. I had to hide it. I took the small device from its compartment. It was surprisingly heavy, dense, and felt warm now, as if holding a residual charge. I slipped it into my pocket. The panel on the cube slid silently shut, leaving no trace it had ever been open. Now for the hard part. The cube must have weighed close to a ton. Using a combination of the winch, a system of block and tackle I kept for emergencies, and every ounce of strength I had, I began the agonizing process of moving it. I strained, my muscles screaming, sweat pouring down my face. I maneuvered it to the edge of the deck, lining it up with the rickety dock at my small, secluded cabin. The last of the fog gave me the cover I needed. With a final, desperate heave and a prayer to anyone who might be listening, I sent it sliding down a pair of thick wooden planks and onto the dock with a ground-shaking thud that sent a flock of crows screeching from the nearby trees. The rest of the day was a blur of paranoid, back-breaking labor. I wrestled the cube into my old workshop, a glorified shed filled with rusted tools and the smell of sawdust and motor oil. I cleared a space in the back, behind a stack of old lumber, and with the help of a chain hoist, settled it into its new hiding place. I covered it with a heavy canvas tarp, but it was a pathetic gesture. A tarp couldn't hide what this thing was. It was like trying to hide a black hole. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind afraid not of questions. I sat in my small kitchen, the strange, smooth device on the table in front of me. I turned it over and over in my hands. There were no buttons, no seams, just the faint, gray lines. What was it? A key? A remote? A weapon? The silence of the house pressed in on me. I was alone with the biggest secret in human history. I got up and walked to the window, looking out over the dark river, trying to calm the frantic beat of my heart. And then I saw them. High in the clear, star-dusted sky, 3 points of light were moving. They weren't planes. They weren't satellites. They moved with an impossible speed and a chilling silence, executing turns at right angles, stopping on a dime. They were tracing a search pattern in the sky, a grid of silent, watchful light directly above Havenwood. They weren't just lights. They were looking for something. My blood turned to slush in my veins. The three lights moved with a terrifying, unnatural precision, like the tips of invisible fingers drawing lines across the night sky. They weren't from around here. They weren't from anywhere on Earth. A primal, instinctual fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the awe and wonder I'd felt earlier. I had pulled something from the river, and now something else was looking for it. And they were looking right here. I stumbled back from the window, my hand clamping down on the device on my kitchen table. Was this a beacon? Was I broadcasting my location to whatever was piloting those silent, geometric patterns in the sky? I snatched it up, my mind racing. I needed to hide it, but where? They had a map. The cube had shown me a map that started with my boat. They knew the area. My cabin was the most logical place to start. I was exposed. My gaze fell on the old cast-iron stove in the corner of my living room. It was my grandfather's, a heavy, ornate beast I rarely used. It was solid, thick metal. Maybe it was enough. I pried open the heavy door, the hinges groaning in protest, and shoved the device deep into the cold ashes at the back. It felt foolish, like a child hiding a cookie, but it was the only thing I could think to do. I needed to act normal. If they were watching, they needed to see a simple fisherman ending his day. I forced myself through the motions. I made dinner, my hands shaking so badly I spilled half the can of beans on the floor. I tried to watch the small television on my counter, but the cheerful inanity of a late-night talk show felt like a broadcast from another universe. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept glancing at the window, but the lights were gone. The sky was empty, filled only with the familiar indifferent stars. The absence of the lights was somehow more terrifying than their presence. Were they gone, or had they just gotten closer? Sleep was impossible. I lay in my bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The silence was a taut membrane, and I was waiting for it to tear. Sometime after midnight, it did. It started with a low hum, the same deep, resonant frequency as the cube, but this time it was all around me. It wasn't just a sound I heard with my ears. It was a pressure I felt in my chest, a vibration that made my teeth ache. The water in the glass on my nightstand began to ripple, forming intricate, concentric patterns. The floorboards of the cabin thrummed. I crept to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, hovering silently over the center of the river, no more than 100 yards from my dock, was a craft. It was shaped like a sleek obsidian teardrop, absorbing the moonlight, reflecting nothing. It was utterly black, a void against the star-dusted sky. There were no lights, no engines, no sound except for that pervasive, bone-jarring hum. One of the searchers had found its mark. As I watched, frozen in a state of pure terror, a section of the craft's underside dilated, opening like an iris. A beam of pale blue light, much wider and more diffuse than the one from the cube, shot down and struck the water. The river didn't splash, it didn't even ripple. The water directly under the beam simply parted. It peeled back like a curtain, exposing the muddy, rock-strewn riverbed below. The beam was holding back tons of water, creating a perfect dry cylinder reaching all the way to the bottom. I was looking at the floor of the old deeps, the place my father swore was bottomless. 2 figures descended in the beam of light. They weren't wearing suits or helmets. They moved with a slow, liquid grace that was both beautiful and profoundly unsettling. They were tall, impossibly slender, their limbs elongated like stretched taffy. Their skin, visible in the pale blue glow, was the color of bleached bone. They had no discernible faces, just smooth, ovoid heads that tilted this way and that, as if sensing the world through means other than sight. They landed silently on the exposed riverbed and began to move, their feet making no impression on the soft mud. They were searching the spot where I had pulled the cube from the water. My mind was screaming. They knew. They knew exactly where it had been. How long would it take them to work their way from the river to my dock, from my dock to my workshop? I was a rat in a trap, and the exterminators had arrived. The device. I had to get rid of the device. The stove wasn't enough. I needed to get it far away from me, from the cabin, from the cube. I scrambled to the stove, my movements clumsy with panic. I pulled the device from the ashes. It was warm to the touch, and the gray lines on its surface were now glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. It was reacting to the ship. It was a beacon. It was calling to them. I had one chance, my truck. It was old and loud, but it was fast. If I could get to the highway, get to town, I could lose the device somewhere, throw it in a dumpster, bury it in the woods miles from here. It was a stupid, desperate plan, but it was the only one I had. I stuffed the glowing stone into the pocket of my jacket, grabbed my truck keys, and eased the back door of the cabin open. The hum from the ship was louder out here, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The air was cold and carried a strange, sterile scent, like ozone after a lightning strike. I moved through the shadows, keeping low, my eyes fixed on the two skeletal figures still scouring the riverbed. They seemed completely focused on their task. I reached the truck, my fingers fumbling with the keys. The lock turning sounded like a gunshot in the humming silence. I slid into the driver's seat, my heart in my throat. I didn't dare use the headlights. I put the key in the ignition, said a silent prayer, and turned. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. I tried again. A gut-wrenching grind of metal on metal, then silence. The battery was dead. Completely, utterly dead. I stared at the dashboard. Even the clock wasn't lit. It was like every ounce of electricity had been drained from the vehicle. The hum. It wasn't just a sound. It was an energy field, some kind of electromagnetic pulse that had fried my truck. I was trapped. My gaze snapped back to the river. The two figures on the riverbed had stopped searching. Their smooth, featureless heads turned in perfect unison. They were looking directly at my cabin, directly at me. In my pocket, the device suddenly flared with a brilliant blue light, growing hot against my leg. A new sound split the air, a high-pitched, piercing chime that emanated from the ship above, and in that moment I realized my catastrophic mistake. The truck hadn't failed on its own. They hadn't been searching the river for the cube. They knew it wasn't there. The ship, the figures, the drained battery, it wasn't a search. It was a trap, and I had just sprung it. Panic is a cold fire. It burns away thought, leaving only the raw instinct to run. My body screamed at me to flee, to bolt into the dark woods and never look back. But where could I run that they couldn't follow? The two figures on the riverbed began to rise, ascending the column of light with the same unhurried, terrifying grace. The piercing chime from the ship intensified, vibrating in my skull, and I knew I had seconds before they were upon me. The device in my pocket was a hot, pulsing weight, a betrayal. I wasn't holding a key, I was holding a leash, and they were pulling on it. A different instinct, something deeper and more stubborn, pushed back against the fear. It was the same instinct that had made my grandfather cast his nets in an unknown river, the same grit that had kept my father on the water through storms and floods. This was my home, my cabin, my catch. I wouldn't be hunted on my own land without a fight. The plan that formed in my mind was insane, born of pure desperation, but it was a plan. I wrenched the device from my pocket. It was almost too hot to hold. I sprinted from the truck, not towards the woods, but back towards my workshop. The hum from the ship above seemed to focus on me, a tangible pressure pushing me down. The world took on a strange, distorted quality, the edges of my vision blurring as the energy field intensified. I burst through the workshop door, the smell of sawdust and oil a strangely comforting anchor to my old life. I ripped the canvas tarp off the cube. There it sat, a block of absolute darkness in the gloom. It was inert, silent. "Wake up!" I hissed, my voice a ragged whisper. "Come on, wake up!" I slammed the hot, glowing device down onto the cube's flat top. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment the device made contact, a shockwave of force erupted from the cube, throwing me backward. I landed hard against a stack of lumber. The wind knocked out of me. The workshop exploded with light and sound. The cube was no longer black. It was a blinding lattice of blue-white energy, the patterns I'd seen before now blazing with the intensity of a star. The low hum was replaced by a deafening harmonic roar that shook the very foundations of the shed. The air crackled with ozone, and my tools rattled on the walls, some of them lifting into the air, caught in the powerful magnetic field. Outside, the piercing chime from the alien ship faltered, replaced by a discordant shriek of alarm. The focused beam of light over the river vanished, and the water crashed back into the void with a sound like thunder. The two slender figures, halfway to their ship, were plunged into darkness. The cube was doing something. It wasn't just a map or a container, it was a machine, and the smaller device was its ignition key. On its surface, the light coalesced, forming another holographic projection. But this wasn't a map. It was a weapon schematic. I saw the teardrop-shaped ship, rendered in glowing detail. Red lines highlighted specific points on its hull. A power core, a propulsion system, a weapons array. Below the schematic, complex alien equations and symbols scrolled past at an impossible speed. Calculations for trajectory, energy output, and structural weaknesses. It was analyzing its attacker. It was preparing to fight back. Suddenly, a section of the cube's side slid open, and a long segmented appendage, like a metallic tentacle, snaked out. It moved with lightning speed, its tip glowing with concentrated energy. It wasn't aimed at the ship. It was aimed at me. I froze, my life flashing before my eyes. But it didn't strike. It stopped a foot from my chest, the glowing tip hovering over the pocket of my jacket. From the pocket, I pulled out the only other thing I had on me, the keys to my dead truck. The appendage gently plucked them from my trembling hand, the metal keys sparking as they made contact. It retracted into the cube, and the schematic of the enemy ship was replaced by a rendering of my old, rusted Ford. The cube was analyzing the pathetic technology of my truck, the simple chemistry of its lead-acid battery. The equations shifted, the symbols changed. It was learning, adapting. Then, everything happened at once. 3 more appendages shot from the cube. One plunged into the damp earth floor of the workshop. Another latched onto the steel frame of my chain hoist. The third one shot out through the open door and attached itself to the frame of my dead truck with a loud clang. The harmonic roar of the cube changed pitch, rising to a feverish shriek. The lights in my workshop flickered on, burning with impossible brightness before exploding in a shower of sparks. The entire building groaned. The cube was drawing power from everything it could touch. The raw electricity from my truck's fried systems, the static charge in the air, the galvanic energy from the metals, the telluric currents from the earth itself. It was a parasite, an energy vampire, and it was starving. Above, the alien ship must have realized what was happening. A new sound cut through the chaos, the high-energy whine of a weapon charging. A sickly green light began to glow from the ship's underbelly. They were going to destroy the cube, and me along with it. Before they could fire, the cube unleashed its counterattack. A beam of pure, focused energy, thicker and more brilliant than anything I could have imagined, erupted from its top surface. It punched a perfectly round hole through the roof of my workshop and slammed into the teardrop ship with a cataclysmic boom that was utterly silent, an impact of pure energy that vaporized the air around it. The ship, the void-black silent hunter, shuddered violently. Its green weapon charge sputtered and died. The silent, graceful craft listed in the air like a wounded animal. For a moment it just hung there, crippled. Then, with a final groaning tear of stressed metal, it began to fall. It tumbled end over end, crashing into the far side of the river with a titanic splash that sent a wave washing over my dock. There was a brief, intense flash of light from beneath the water, and then silence. The light from the cube faded, the appendages retracted. The roar subsided, replaced by the gentle lapping of the river and the frantic chirping of startled crickets. It was over. The cube was once again a perfect black silent object, resting in the center of my ruined workshop. The only sign of the battle was the perfectly round hole in my roof, through which I could see the calm, indifferent stars. I stood there for a long time, shaking, covered in sawdust, my ears ringing. I was just a fisherman, a simple man who knew the river. But in one night, I had been caught in the crossfire of a conflict that spanned galaxies. The cube wasn't just a relic lost in the mud. The markings on it, I realized, weren't a map. They were a warning. Here be monsters, and the cube was the weapon left behind to fight them. It was a sentry, a guardian, accidentally awakened by the drag of my net. I walked over to it and placed a hand on its cool, smooth surface. This time there was no hum, no vibration. It was just a silent, heavy box. My secret, my burden. I knew my life could never go back to what it was. I couldn't just throw this back into the river, and I couldn't tell a soul. I had a choice, be a terrified witness or become something more. I was the keeper of a sleeping god, a celestial weapon hibernating in my back shed. The hunters were gone, for now, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, they would be back. And when they returned, the fisherman from Havenwood would be ready. I looked from the silent cube to the dark river and back up at the stars. My little stretch of the murky water was no longer just a fishing spot. It was the front line, and I was its sole defender.